No worries. Look, thanks everybody for attending. I'm hoping we can do this a few times over the next few months because I think the industry is going to need it. I've got a whole bunch of slides to fit into half an hour, so I'm going to do an Aaron Coots and talk really, really quickly. Given what's happened in the last sort of week, time to pretty up the slides, so I've made use of PowerPoint's wonderful sort of custom-made templates. So forgive some of the presentation. I want to start by thanking the staff at these different clubs that I've been fortunate enough to work at over the past sort of 10 years. This is my 23rd year in the industry. And I've been fortunate enough to work with a bunch of staff, and the staff who are a bunch of really good staff, and the staff at these clubs have helped a lot in forming my opinion and changing my opinion in many cases, and also helped a lot with these slides that I'm going to put up. So if those people at different clubs like Tom Allen at Arsenal and Stu Graham at Port Adelaide, if you see your slides there, I've unashamedly taken them. So yeah, you can get into me afterwards. I'm going to talk about performance and injury, and they're just as important as each other. And we've got a lot of technology at the moment, and to be honest, it goes into what Warren was talking about. I think we can probably overdo it, and we have overdone it, and I've been guilty of that, and I've sort of brought my way back into a more simple form of analysis and simple form of monitoring. So we do have a lot of technology, but what's really important to understand is that technology and data will never affect the outcome. It's obviously the people that interpret the data that will, and it's our job. I've always seen it as my job as a sports scientist or fitness coach or performance manager, whatever title you want to call yourself, to provide the coach with the information, and the coach makes the decision. It's extremely important that we understand that. We don't make the decision, the coach makes the decision. And you only have to speak to guys like Tony Strudwick, who've been around for a while, and Warren, and to hear coaches who have that initial, even without any data, just their eyes. So it's our job to provide the coach with a decision, and then he or she makes that decision. The day in the life of the modern footballer, and some of these slides I've presented variations of before. If you look at those things on the right, as you look at it, there's a lot of monitoring type activity there. I'm just going to quickly talk about each of those and then provide you with examples. There are some fairly sensitive information here, so as long as they don't find their way, retweeted and things like that, that'd be great. I've tried to take out names as much as possible. So sleep, which of these, sorry, before I get onto it, have actually level 1 evidence? And when you actually go through the data, there's not a whole lot that actually have first degree evidence to say that, yep, they absolutely work. And I'll speak about them individually. Sleep, look, we know that affects performance and injury, but the evidence is pretty crappy. We know that obviously training and gym loading positively influence performance and reduce injuries. But again, the evidence of monitoring that is actually quite poor. If we take each of those, sleep, we know that there's some good issues, good research on sleep, but the technology to assess that sleep is quite poor. Unless we have polysomnography and we're in a university setting and there's no team that are going to allow their athletes to be subjected to that type of technology and that type of monitoring prior to games and after games. So we're left with best guesses in the form of accelerometry-based devices. So it's not fantastic. So there's still a question mark, but it's probably still worth doing. Really fancy graphics I've got for you guys there, as you can see. If we look at wellness and subjectives, and this is where it gets a bit controversial, I guess. Asking players how they feel is always been a little bit uncomfortable for me, because I know if I was a player and I was never known, I would bullshit my way through to getting selected and hiding injuries. And sorry, Steve, for the language. I'll try and keep that to a minimum. So there's no reason to suggest that players won't do that. Of course, with an educated group, you can assume the best scenario. But I do have some inherent difficulties with using, totally relying on subjective scores. And we know that there's some pretty good research by pretty good researchers which tell us what affect RPEs and subjective scores. And we know that, for example, if we were to just extend the time of a session, even if the intensity is lower and the distance is lower, just extend the time of the session, we can artificially manufacture higher RPEs and things like that. So we know that they're not always reflective of the session, but due to convenience, and as Ibrahim said earlier, they're pretty easy to use. So for me, it's still a bit of a question mark, and it's great. I'm sure Rob Pacey is listening on his 8th cup of tea at the moment. But Jason Weber, who's one of the best in the business, in a recent episode only last week, suggested that he doesn't take RPEs based on 15 years of pretty consistent data in a homogeneous group. He now finds it unreliable, so he doesn't take it. And also Sam Robertson at the Bulldogs, who's one of the smartest practitioners out there in terms of statistics and the ability to apply them. He also suggested that RPE in a team environment might not be as valid as what we might think. So these guys are pretty smart cookies, and they don't take RPE, so it's not the be-all and end-all as far as I'm concerned. I think one of the ways in which we can get this even better is by looking at something as simple as heart rate. And here we've got some of the great work that David Regan's done with Melbourne Football Club at the moment, and just a Power BI database where we can just monitor heart rate trim versus high-speed running per player per game, and we can look at trends in that. And therefore we know the cost, we know the output with GPS, and we know the cost of that in terms of heart rate. I am cycling through these. A lot of data on this graph. This is one of report that we put together. And probably the correlations down the bottom left are the best things. Players pull up sore from training. You can see high or zone 6 distance, which is sprint distance down the bottom, has a great correlation with general muscle soreness. But 2 rows below that, zone 6 distance at training has a great correlation also with match zone 6 output. So players pull up sore from training, but they're able to produce more match output, which is what we want. So the player soreness can often be a good thing and not necessarily a bad thing from training, as long as it doesn't go too far. Again, subjective scores, not the be-all and end-all from my point of view. If we go down to heart rate variability, there's some great research on heart rate variability in both general population, in linear sports, as well as in team sports. Again, the problem is the measurement of it and the estimation of it. The technology is pretty good and pretty accurate, but the controls around and Martin Bouchard, who's speaking later on, was at the forefront of suggesting how difficult this might be. It's still a question mark. I think the concept behind it is not in dispute, but how to apply it in a team sport setting is. Screening, great fellow Jordan Rees there, one of the great physios at Arsenal. Screening, again, a lot of research on screening. Probably the most significant paper is Roald Barr's paper, which I'm sure we've all read. And we know through some pretty good work at Arsenal through Mikhail and Tom Allen there that we put together, that often the screening didn't have much of an impact on match outcome, on injury, or in fact the previous match didn't have much influence on screening. So it's really a question mark for me, but it does allow you to start a conversation, which is the excuse, not the excuse, but the reason I hear for many people screening and taking sleep scores and taking wellness and taking RPE. It allows you to start a conversation. The question that I would have is, how many conversations do you need to start? So I would probably pick 1 or 2 of those at maximum, and probably use those without using all of them. The evidence is just not there, both the applied evidence as well as the evidence within the literature. some of the great stuff that Jordan set up at Arsenal, you can see there. We looked at knee to wall, counter movement, jump, groin bar, and some hamstring scores, and we had a nice single sheet, which a single output, which allowed us to have a look and identify people who were 1 or 2 standard deviations above their typical score. We looked at this also at Port Adelaide, and we looked at a few other scores, the recovery queue. We designed through Chris Vergler's and Stu Graham and myself put together a submax yo-yo, which we published, and we were able to put some fitness fatigue variables, or Stu Graham was able to put some fitness fatigue variables together and paint a bigger picture of player readiness, which we can talk about shortly. We then go into monitoring training, and this is the sort of the holy grail and where it all started with GPS and heart rate in terms of monitoring training, and our our training output sheet you can see there on your screen, which was pretty stock standard. I'm sure most teams do something similar to this. One of the things that we did was we actually put it in player terms and made it a bit more competitive. You can see there, Tom Allen designed this, and running what we put up on the board, because putting this in the players' dressing room doesn't really indicate much. Giving that to coaches takes a lot of education, so we made it a bit simpler and ranked players that way. We can also rank drills and rank drills according to how they related to game outputs. So that was a pretty simple drill sheet that we looked at, which looked at all the drills that we did in training and where they rated with a simple traffic light system compared to match output, which, as most of you know, tends to get a lot more traction with coaches and players when you can relate it to a match. We know through some of the great work of the OPARS group here in Melbourne, and Steve Dohey firstly suggested that if we can sum high-speed running, sum Z-score over 4 weeks, we know that there's a greater hamstring risk. So the purpose of monitoring is either to improve performance or to decrease injury risk, and that's pretty much how we're judged. And so we know that monitoring training loads will, if we know that it can decrease injury risk, then obviously it's worthwhile doing. And we know that 4 weeks of summed greater than these values that you can see on screen. So, 6.9 Z-score over 4 weeks, it's a pretty big increase in high-speed running. We know that will increase your hamstring injury risk, and the probabilities there of sort of 0.63 are pretty solid. So that's a pretty good reason to monitor training loads. One of the issues that I have is when it gets into sort of custom algorithms and people start developing their own sort of black box areas, and I've certainly seen some good ones and bad ones about this, and I'll talk you through a couple of practical ones that I've used across the journey. The fitness and fatigue modelling is nothing new. This is model 1975, but Stu Graham was one of the first to sort of bring it into team sports, and he's published his information. And that modelling is based on aspects of fitness versus aspect or the rate of decline in fitness versus the rate of accumulation of fatigue. And we looked at fitness variables, GPS variables, and then looked at fatigue variables, some of the ones that we put up earlier, and Stu was able to model these using some pretty good algorithms and produce player readiness. And that was certainly a really worthwhile experience. And like I said, he's published all of that, so you can find all of that online, and he's done an outstanding job at identifying player readiness based on fitness effects and the accumulation of fatigue. Tom Allen put together this based on some Barclays Bank algorithms, and what you can see with this particular player is their objectives, so GPS outputs and objective scores in black, and then wellness in red. And when they start to deviate, you can see this player's decline due to a muscle issue. So wellness was reduced as well, which you can imagine you're not playing, you're injured, so your wellness is reduced. Suddenly the game time and the frequency of games increase, but the wellness doesn't rise with that, so that you know that there's an overload coming, because the wellness is down, but the physical output is up. So we have a bit of an issue there. So that enabled Tom and myself to look at each individual player and adjust their training load accordingly. We looked at some neural networking, started at Liverpool based on some great works with some people at the Swans in the AFL, and we attempted to predict injury. So we inputted the week and the 2 weeks load coming up. That can be as simple as RP, GPS variables, and then the neural network allowed us to predict, if we did carry out this load, what would the risk of injury being. The trouble with neural networking, as the US military found out, is it doesn't identify where the problem is. It just identifies that there is a problem. So it's up to you, the practitioner, to find out why the network suggested that you might have got injured. Now, understand, the network is only based on the information that you put into it. So if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. So if you're not putting valid, reliable measures in, then neural networks are no good for you. What it did show us is that these scores that constantly produced higher risk were zone 6 distance over 7 days prior to injury. So sprint distance 7 days prior to injury. The training effect using, which was using heart rate training effect, using first beat, the 28 days prior to injury had a pretty good prediction. Epoch 7 days prior to injury had a pretty good prediction, again using first beat. Accelerations 28 days prior to injury, as well as the Burgess score, which is a bit embarrassing that I left this up there, but it was just a coach's rating of training. So I rated training based on how hard I thought training was. So if you're doing 5K, when it's 20 degrees, that might get you 1 score. If you do 5K when it's 35 degrees in Dubai, then obviously GPS shows no difference, but you as a coach know that it's different, so you might get a higher score. I'll cycle through these in the interest of time, but that's just further neural network activity. But it proved really successful at Liverpool in reducing injuries. The acute versus chronic is a really interesting one. We looked at 3 years of information using Mladen at Port Adelaide. He did the analysis on this, but myself, Ian McEwen, and Stu Graham put, with the help of the medical staff, and Mladen crunched the numbers. And we found that using the acute chronic, we were able to predict every single injury after the event. So once the acute chronic is trained on our data set, we're able to predict injuries perfectly. But as soon as you took a new data set and put it in, the reds were injuries there that players suffered, soft tissue injuries. And you can see that acute chronic wasn't able to predict anything. So that was 2015, and that was when we first started to question that maybe there was more to it. And the acute chronic should perhaps just be used as a guide rather than a specific injury prediction. There's been enough written and said about that, so I probably don't need to go on about that. But that was work that I put together in 2014 or 15. One of the other issues that I have with all of these types of ratios, whether you're using rolling average, acute chronic, or whatever, even just, I did my PhD on GPS analysis of training load, so it kind of hurts me to say this, but sometimes it's full of crap, and sometimes you have to break the mold and break what academia says. So we know, for instance, that shock microcycles, I should say, we know that they work in terms of creating an excellent fitness benefit. But if you put any shock microcycle into any algorithm, black box, any training load monitoring system, there will be red alerts everywhere. And sports scientists and fitness coaches will all say, no, you shouldn't do it. But we know in practice that they work. There is a risk to them, but as long as you mitigate the risk, we know both in practice as well as in all of this research that they work. So that's one of the other problems in practice and in the field that I have with a lot of sort of custom algorithms, is that there'll be red alerts everywhere, but we know that they work. Moving on to know that loading has a positive effect on both performance and negative or can reduce injury rates. So we know that that works. Some of the monitoring of it is a little bit controversial, and there's not a lot of evidence, but we know, for example, through Ryan Timmons' great work, that you increase your fascicle length, you will reduce the probability of injury. So even for old athletes where we know that age is a risk, and this is done by a whole range of different athletes in different sports. This particular graph was looking at A-League in Australia, which is soccer and football. And even the effects of age can be mitigated if you work on increasing your fascicle length. And this has become pretty commonplace now and not in dispute. We also know that with fascicle length, even people who have poor Nordboard scores and poor eccentric hamstring strength, we know that as long as you increase your fascicle length, we know that that can mitigate even against poor strength. Obviously, you want both. And there's enough research around to show you how to increase your fascicle length. And that's a story for another of Steve's lecture series. So for the last 7-8 minutes, I'm just going to talk you through a situation where we put all this together and got a pretty good result. Looking at Arsenal, one of the unique scenarios about Arsenal, I'm not sure why that continues to go ahead, but I'll just keep playing back like this. You get 61 games in a season. You get a pretty tough environment where there's a lot of nationalities. The coaches didn't speak English at our last year there. And the way that I could best demonstrate this was using this graph. At the top there, you see the month of October, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, those numbers across the top are dates. The yellows are games, so EPL away, Europa League home, EPL home, Carling Cup home, EPL home. The initials down the side are players who played in the match M. Under the NM line is no matches. Under the 23s are people who played the under 23s. And under the injured line are people who played injured. So we didn't know the team from week to week. We had no idea. There was 9 games in 31 days during this period. And we didn't know the team. The coach, like a lot of coaches in the Premier League, wouldn't tell you the team until just before the game. But to show you the changes in changes in team selection and injured to uninjured and 23s to not selected to play the game, let's have a look at this graph. You can see how we changed teams. We had 3 players who played every single game in that time but were on the bench. We had 1 player who played in every single game in that time, unsurprisingly, in 9 games in 31 days with only 2 days off, which were the days in red there. You can see up the top. He was injured shortly after that. So what we decided to do is use this graph, which I stole from Tony Strudwick, and that's what can you control in those circumstances? You can complain all you want about the circumstance in front of you, but what can you control? And let's work on those things that you can control, not those that you can't. And in that scenario, there's a whole range of different things that you can control. All of these things you can control in this situation. So that's what we decided to focus on, particularly in the 2018-19 season, in order to reduce the quite high injury rates that were there prior to 2017-18. Understanding while you try and control these things, again, this is Ryan Timmons, who's looked at more hamstring injuries than probably all of us combined. We can only predict or evaluate, or we only know about 35%. The rest of it we don't know about. So we know age, eccentric strength, fascicle length, and previous hamstring injuries accounts for about 35% in terms of the variance. There's still 65% we don't know, and probably a lot of that comes to this, the biopsychosocial model of injury and performance, and that's already been mentioned tonight and or this morning for you guys in the UK. But Laura Mosley's outstanding work in this area. We know how much this influences performance, and probably through the help of David Priestley and some good practitioners at Arsenal, that that was a heavy influence. You can hear my dishwasher in the background there, so I apologise for that. That was a real heavy influence in the way we went about things over there. We also looked at the athlete values, the evidence, as well as clinical expertise, and tried to look at evidence-based practice, which is nothing new. But we needed to take the coach's view, each of us in terms of practitioners' views, as well as the evidence that was out there, and we tried to combine all of that. What we had is we wanted that philosophy according to the coach, and this is nothing new. This wasn't particularly our philosophy, but a philosophy of Mourinho and tactical periodization. So that's where load monitoring assisted us a lot in that area, but also understanding through some of the great analysis of Mikhail, our data scientist there. We found no relationship between training GPS loads and match GPS output. So it didn't matter how hard we trained or how low we trained. There was no relationship between that and how much the players physically worked during the game. So I go to a lot of conferences and hear a lot of people talk about, oh, we trained 10% higher than normal, and that meant our match output was compromised. In 150 odd games with Arsenal, we couldn't find any relationship at all in that. So that was really interesting to sort of, because we all panic when coaches train too much or too little. We couldn't find a relationship amongst this playing group in any case. Where we did use a lot of monitoring was post soft tissue injuries to have a look at where we may have erred, and we may have trained them too hard or too little, and that's just an example of one particular soft tissue injury. And Tom Allen put together this great report showing that a player training 6 days in a row is probably not great. I won't go through the numbers there, and repeated exposures to max speed probably didn't help their cause. Some of those we could control, some of those we couldn't, but unless we monitored, unless we collected this information, we couldn't find it. I know I'm talking quickly because Steve's about to jump on and give me the wind-up call. Where monitoring also helps is looking at two-way running. So when I say two-way, when you do have the ball and when you don't have the ball, and that can be a lot of problems with players, and coaches will often say, oh, they're not running without the ball and they are running with the ball. Unless you have this objective information, you can't clarify that. Certainly, this is some AFL data with Port Adelaide. We could clarify when players were working with the ball and without the ball. We could also play and appropriately program players' return to play. You can see on the top of that graph is the training loads that we put this particular player through, and then in the middle of this table, you can see the last 7 days. So we could look at acute, chronic as a guide, and 7 to 14 and 14 to 21. And finally, down the bottom of that, we can look at the match average for this particular player, as well as the worst case scenario in terms of the highest match output for this particular player. And so that allows us as practitioners to compare what they did and didn't do. When we first arrived at Arsenal in 2017-18, the probability of hamstring injury based on age, previous injury, fascicle length, and Nordboard scores was quite high. So that's the graph there indicating the probability of hamstring injury for the various players. And so we worked on trying to improve both Nordboard and fascicle length throughout the time we were there, and we had some success through some pretty good measures to improve that while we're there. And you can see that the day lost muscle injury over the duration of the time there improved. So with some pretty good monitoring and some awareness that it's not always about the objective and subjective, it's about the biopsychosocial, and to control what you can control, we got a pretty good result throughout our time there. What we also found is that the match output, which you can see there, the high speed, also improved in our time there. So whilst I'm not I've been guilty in the past of a whole range of different monitoring errors and training load errors due to reliance on probably too much of the technology. I think there's a path towards a happy medium of your athletes, knowing your athletes, certainly knowing your coaches and respecting their input, but also using the technology and using the data as long as it's valid and reliable for your specific population. Thank you. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer those at a later time or whenever's convenient for you, Steve.
Yeah. Cheers, Darren. Thank you very much. Really insightful and really useful. I like the guest appearance from your dishwasher as well.
Just keeping it real, mate. Keeping it real.
Yeah, exactly. We've all got to. I think, I am genuinely surprised that you haven't heard a loud scream from my little boy in the background at some point. So I'm quite thankful that keeping quiet. But no, it was great, and it was like there's a ton of questions coming through from email and some of the Q&As and stuff like that. So I'll catch up with you and ask a few questions and stuff like that.
Yeah, can I just add, Steve, one thing quickly? It's a real bad time for our industry at the moment. It's a bad time for a lot of industries, so we're not immune to it. But a lot of people in Australia and probably around the world are losing their jobs and are going with, on forced leave without pay and things like this. And it's going to happen overseas as well when leagues come back from this hiatus. So if we can stick together as an industry and use this time as you're doing, Steve, I think it's fantastic. If we can throw some more of these in, I'm happy to contribute in whatever way I can.